One of the most important questions we can ask is whether the Bible is true, whether it's accurate in what it describes. And part of that question is concerned with looking at how we went from the original accounts of the inspired authors 2,000 plus years ago, from there to the Bible you hold in your hands in the pew at church today. How did we get from those original manuscripts to the versions that you and I read? Well, within that question, there is a lot of room for study and discussion. But today I want to look at one particular area, which is sometimes cited by skeptics as a reason for doubting the truth of the Bible. But once we understand, it actually gives us additional reason for confidence that the method that God chose to get his inspired word to us was actually a method which gives us every reason to believe that what we're reading in our hands today is in fact what those inspired authors wrote a couple thousand years ago. So as we look at particularly the New Testament, you have the life of Jesus, the important events that are particularly the focus of the Gospels, occurring around 30 or so AD. Well, from those events to the first written accounts in the so-called synoptic Gospels, that would be Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you have about 30 years or so. And then actually another few decades before we get to the fourth and final gospel that was written, that of John. So focusing on the synoptic gospels, even those first gospels, you have that 30-year or so gap to take us from the events to when they were written down. Now that gap at first glance looks maybe a little suspicious. Looks like we would have to question, well, how do we know that the story didn't change from when the events happened to when we actually have that written account, which sort of sets it down more concisely, more accurately, perhaps, we might think. Can we trust that that written account was based on good facts, if those facts had to be remembered for 30 years? Well, to start with, we can certainly understand why there was a gap of 30 years or so from the events to when they were written down. At first, the church in Jerusalem was pretty local, and you're having this religion develop in an oral culture, a culture where you don't have a whole lot of writing, where many people are illiterate, and therefore, if you all know the stories, and if you're a culture that's used to recording history through oral recitation, why would you write it down? But then as the apostles began to age, as the church spread across the Mediterranean world, you begin to realize, okay, we need to record this, write it down, and commit it to paper, and we'll have a more lasting record and one that can be shared with churches in other locations. So that's why the gap exists. But you still have to ask, well, what was happening in that 30-year period? Can we trust the account? And in fact, I would urge that far from being a concern for us, that 30-year period of oral tradition, recording the stories of what happened during the years of Jesus' life, his death, his resurrection, etc., that 30-year gap actually gives us great reason for confidence. And here's why. I want you to imagine what would have happened if there had been a single account written of Jesus' life, let's say a couple of years after he died. It's written by somebody with their own ideological agenda, their own axe to grind, and they write down, maybe they fudge some details, they add some things Jesus said, they change some of the story. Well, that account, probably wouldn't get much traction in the Jerusalem community itself because they all know that it's not true. They've literally experienced the events that are being misrepresented in this hypothetical early written account. But, the hypothetical author is persistent. He sends out a few copies, north to Asia Minor, south to Egypt. And, a few copies hang around. They persist. Some people believe them. Eventually, they work their way back. And, after a few decades, they get back to Jerusalem. And perhaps people are a little bit less confident by then. It's a written account. Maybe it must have happened. You sort of get a survival of the fittest. When one account is written down, it gives it an extra credibility. And you could imagine how an early inaccurate account, by being first out of the gate, might have perhaps distorted people's memories in retrospect. But that obviously isn't what happened. What happened is, providentially, there was no immediate written account. Instead, you have, for reasons I explained, an oral tradition culture recording events through creed, through recitation of history, the mechanisms that would be very polished, very practiced in that kind of a culture. Everybody would be used to remembering details, sharing them with others, listening to stories carefully, transmitting those stories with accuracy. That's just how an oral culture works. So that was the method through which these stories are maintained and remembered for 3 decades or so in a community where the events actually happened and overseen by the 12 apostles who personally experienced them and had an authority to correct mistakes, either intentional or accidental. So it's a very democratic process. You've got everybody, so to speak, working together to remember what they individually had experienced. You think of it like our own history. Can you remember pretty accurately things that happened 30, even 40 years ago? If somebody says, oh yeah, the United States won the Vietnam War, or, remember, when Ronald Reagan blew up Iran, or things like that, you would say, no, that's not what happened, because we remember those recent events that we experienced. Well, the same thing would have happened in the Jerusalem church with inaccuracies that might have been introduced to the account. In fact, anthropologists who study the few remaining oral tradition cultures that are out there will tell us that it usually takes several generations for any sort of substantive error to creep into an oral tradition, because everybody corrects immediately those sorts of mistakes. And remember, that's just a natural process. That's not even speaking of the supernatural, of the Holy Spirit, carefully shepherding this account, maintaining its accuracy. That gives us just a whole other layer for confidence. But even just speaking naturalistically, an oral tradition in an oral culture is going to be curated, protected, maintained by the whole community of collective memory. And then as those stories are recorded in that environment, that's then where we have the Gospels being written down. And you have Mark, you have Matthew, you have Luke, who record and write down based on what the community remembers collectively, overseen by the apostles, ultimately inspired by the Holy Spirit. It's the best imaginable way to have an accurate record then. And then once you've got that firm foundation of collective memory, then those Gospels can go out with an authority and a confidence. And we can trust them because they're rooted in 30 years of carefully maintained memory by a community of what they experienced, of what they remembered. And that's why we shouldn't think of that 30-year gap as an embarrassment or a concern. It's a safeguard. It's a reason to believe that when the gospel accounts got written down, they recorded what was experienced, what was remembered by those early first century Jewish Christians. They got the details right because the community had been recording, guarding, transmitting those details for years. Then when they were recorded to paper, they could trust them, and we can trust them today.